You're looking at an old photograph from 1898. At first glance, it seems innocent. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting in a Victorian parlor holding a porcelain doll. Sweet, right? Maybe he's playing with his sister's toy. Maybe it's a family portrait. That's what archivists thought for 125 years. But in 2023, when digital restoration technology removed decades of damage and fading, they saw something in the photograph that changed everything. Something hidden in the shadows. Something that turned this cute portrait into one of the most heartbreaking photographs in Victorian history. That boy wasn't playing. He was mourning. In February 2023, Dr. Margaret Chun, a digital archivist at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., was working on a routine restoration project for Victorian-era photographs when she encountered an unusual cabinet card from 1898. The photograph showed a young boy, approximately 8 or 9 years old, seated in what appeared to be a Victorian parlor. He was dressed in dark, formal clothing, knee-length breeches, a dark jacket, and a white collar. In his arms, he held a large porcelain doll with a delicate painted face wearing an elaborate white lace dress. At first, I catalogued it as unidentified boy with toy circa 1898. Dr. Chun explained in an interview. Boys playing with dolls wasn't uncommon in that era. I almost moved on to the next photograph, but something bothered her. The boy's expression was unusually serious, not playful or happy, but intensely somber. His grip on the doll was tight, protective. The composition felt formal, ceremonial, suggesting significance beyond a simple portrait. Dr. Chun decided to subject the photograph to high-resolution digital restoration. The original cabinet card was severely damaged. 125 years of foxing, water stains, fading, and surface deterioration had obscured crucial details. Using advanced imaging technology, she began the painstaking process of digitally removing layers of damage. As the restoration progressed, hidden details began to emerge. First, she noticed the boy's clothing was not ordinary attire, but formal mourning dress. The dark fabric was black crepe, a material specifically used for mourning in Victorian times. A black armband was clearly visible on his left sleeve, a mourning symbol worn to indicate a recent death in the family. Then she enhanced the background. The parlor was draped entirely in black fabric. Victorian mourning curtains covered the windows. On a small table beside the boy sat a framed photograph draped with black ribbon, another mourning custom. Fresh flowers, likely funeral flowers, were visible in a vase. Most revealing was what appeared on a small card visible at the bottom edge of the photograph. When enhanced, Dr. Chun could make out partial text. Memory of Clara, age 6, April 1898. But the most striking discovery came when Dr. Chun examined the doll itself at maximum resolution. The doll's face showed unusual detail and craftsmanship far beyond typical mass-produced Victorian dolls. The features were distinctly individualized, not the generic painted face of a commercial toy, but a carefully rendered portrait. The hair wasn't the typical mohair or synthetic material, but appeared to be real human hair, brown and carefully styled. Dr. Chun consulted with Victorian toy historians and mourning culture experts. They asked her to look for specific details. The quality of the porcelain work, the style of the clothing, the construction of the hands. What they confirmed changed everything. This wasn't an ordinary toy doll. This was a memorial doll, a Victorian death effigy created in the likeness of a deceased child. On the back of the cabinet card, barely legible after restoration, Dr. Chun found a handwritten inscription. Thomas Whitmore, age 8, with memorial. Likeness of his sister Clara, age 6, taken 3 weeks after her passing. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, May 5, 10th, 1898. Photographer J. W. Black & Company. This wasn't a photograph of a boy playing with his sister's toy. This was a memorial portrait. Thomas holding a custom-made porcelain doll created to resemble his dead sister, Clara, who had died just 3 weeks earlier. The photograph suddenly transformed from a curious Victorian portrait into a devastating document of childhood grief and a family's desperate attempt to preserve the memory of their lost daughter. To understand why the Whitmore family would create such a doll, we must understand the Victorian era's relationship with death, particularly the death of children. In the late 1890s, child mortality was devastatingly common. In the United States, approximately 1 in 5 children died before reaching age 5. Diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and whooping cough claimed thousands of young lives annually. No family, regardless of wealth or social class, was immune to the possibility of losing a child. This grim reality shaped Victorian mourning culture into an elaborate, formalized system of rituals designed to publicly acknowledge grief and privately cope with loss. When a child died, families entered strict mourning periods that could last years. Parents, especially mothers, wore a full black mourning dress for a minimum of 1 year, sometimes much longer. Homes were draped in black crepe fabric. Mirrors were covered. Clocks were stopped at the time of death. Social activities ceased entirely. Victorian society didn't just permit open grieving, it demanded it. Mourning was a public performance of love and loss with strict rules about clothing, behavior, and duration. Failure to properly mourn was considered scandalous. But beyond these public rituals, families sought more intimate, tangible ways to maintain connection with their deceased children. Photography became crucial in this process. Postmortem photography, taking photographs of deceased individuals, often posed as if sleeping, was extremely common for many families, especially those of modest means. These postmortem images were the only photographs they would ever have of their child. These weren't considered morbid or disturbing, but precious keepsakes, the last way to capture their child's physical appearance. Memorial dolls represented an even more tangible form of remembrance. The practice of creating memorial dolls was relatively rare, limited primarily to middle and upper-class families who could afford the substantial cost. But for families who could commission them, these dolls served a profound psychological purpose. The creation process was elaborate and deeply personal. A skilled doll maker, often the same craftspeople who created high-end decorative porcelain, would work from photographs of the deceased child and consultations with the family. They would sculpt a clay model of the child's face, carefully replicating distinctive features, the exact shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the contours of the cheeks and nose. This clay model was used to create a porcelain mold. The porcelain would be fired at high temperature, then meticulously hand-painted to match the child's exact coloring, skin tone, eye color, lip color. Glass eyes matching the child's eye color would be carefully set. Most significantly, real human hair, almost always the deceased child's own hair, cut and preserved after death, would be attached to the porcelain head using traditional wig-making techniques. This meant the doll literally contained a physical part of the lost child. The doll would then be dressed in clothing carefully replicated from the child's wardrobe, often their Sunday best or a favorite dress. Some families provided actual garments that had belonged to the child, carefully sized to fit the doll. The cost was substantial. A custom memorial doll could range from $50 to $200, equivalent to approximately $1,800 to $7,200 in today's currency. For context, this was roughly 2 to 8 months' wages for an average worker in 1898. These memorials served multiple functions in grieving families. They provided a focal point for grief, a tangible object that could be held, cared for, and displayed. For surviving siblings like Thomas Whitmore, they offered a way to maintain a relationship with their lost brother or sister. Parents could care for the doll as they had cared for their living child, providing some continuity of purpose during the devastating transition from active parenting to mourning. Some families kept these dolls prominently displayed for years. Others stored them carefully, bringing them out on anniversaries or during particularly difficult periods of grief. A few were eventually buried with the mother when she died, symbolically reuniting parent and child. By the early 1900s, as child mortality rates began declining due to improved medicine and public health, and as Victorian mourning customs gave way to less elaborate practices, memorial dolls became increasingly rare. The practice had largely disappeared by World War I today. Surviving Victorian memorial dolls are extremely rare and highly valued by museums and collectors of mourning memorabilia. They represent a vanished era when families confronted child death with formalized public mourning and, Intimate private rituals that modern sensibilities find both touching and deeply unsettling. After identifying the photograph, Dr. Chun spent weeks researching the Whitmore family through census records, city directories, death certificates, and newspaper archives. She uncovered a heartbreaking story that explained the memorial portrait. Thomas and Clara Whitmore were the children of Edward Whitmore, a textile merchant, and his wife Margaret. The family lived at 8047 Spruce Street in Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square neighborhood, a respectable middle-class area. Edward Whitmore operated a wholesale textile business supplying fabric to tailor and dressmakers throughout Philadelphia. Census records from 1900 indicate the family was comfortable financially. They employed a live-in domestic servant and owned their home, both signs of solid middle-class status. Clara Elizabeth Whitmore was born on March 3, 1892. She was described in a family Bible discovered by genealogical researchers as a lively and affectionate child who loved singing and was learning piano. A notice in the church bulletin from the Second Presbyterian Church mentioned Clara's participation in a children's Easter program in April 1897 where she recited a poem. Thomas Edward Whitmore, born in 1890, was 2 years older than his sister. School records show he attended the Philadelphia Public School on Locust Street. In early April 1898, a scarlet fever epidemic swept through Philadelphia. Scarlet fever, a bacterial infection that primarily affected children, was one of the most feared diseases of the era. It began with a sore throat and high fever, then developed into a distinctive red rash covering the body. In severe cases, complications included pneumonia, kidney damage, and heart failure. A notice in the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin dated April 17, 1898 listed the Whitmore residence at 1847 Spruce Street as under official quarantine due to scarlet fever. A standard public health measure. A red quarantine sign would have been posted on their door, warning neighbors to avoid contact. Death records from the Philadelphia Department of Health confirmed that Clara Whitmore died on April 22, 1898 at 2:30 a.m. The official cause of death was listed as scarlet fever, complications including pneumonia. She was 6 years old, 1 month, and 19 days. Her funeral was held on April 24, 1898. The burial record from Laurel Hill Cemetery shows she was interred in the Whitmore family plot, Section 14, Lot 23. The funeral was necessarily small. Quarantine restrictions and fear of contagion limited attendance to immediate family only. 3 weeks after Clara's death, on May 15, 1898, the Whitmore family visited the studio of J.W. Black & Company, one of Philadelphia's most respected photographic studios located on Chestnut Street. They brought with them a porcelain memorial doll that had been commissioned shortly after Clara's death. The doll had been created by Sarah Mitchell, a Philadelphia doll maker who specialized in memorial work. An invoice discovered in Philadelphia Historical Society archives shows the Whitmore family paid $75 for the memorial doll, a substantial sum equivalent to about 3 months of middle-class wages. The photograph was carefully staged. Thomas, dressed in formal black mourning clothes with a mourning armband, was posed holding the memorial doll, a representation of his deceased sister. The parlor setting was arranged with mourning curtains, a memorial photograph of Clara taken shortly before her death, and funeral flowers. This memorial portrait served multiple purposes. It created a visual document of the family's mourning, proof of their proper grief and respect for Clara's memory. It allowed Thomas to be photographed with his sister one last time, and it preserved the image of the memorial doll itself, which would eventually deteriorate or be lost. What happened to the Whitmore family after 1898 reveals the long-lasting impact of Clara's death. Census records from 1900 show the family still living at the same address, but Margaret Whitmore's occupation is listed as none, likely indicating she was unable to work due to ongoing grief and depression. Edward Whitmore's business declined in the years following Clara's death. By 1905, the family had moved to a smaller, less expensive residence on Pine Street. Edward died in 1911 at age 52. His death certificate lists heart failure as the cause, but family letters suggest he never fully recovered from the grief of losing Clara. Margaret Whitmore lived until 1923. She never had another child. According to her obituary, she requested to be buried holding a small porcelain doll, almost certainly Clara's memorial doll, reuniting mother and symbolic daughter in death. Thomas Whitmore survived to adulthood. He married in 1915 and had 2 daughters, but family stories passed down through generations suggest he remained profoundly affected by his sister's death. He reportedly kept the 1898 memorial photograph in his home his entire life and told his daughters about Clara, the sister he lost when he was just 8 years old. The memorial photograph of Thomas Whitmore holding his sister's memorial doll is not just a historical curiosity. It's also a carefully crafted piece of Victorian memorial photography created by professionals who specialized in documenting grief. J.W. Black & Company, the Philadelphia studio that created the photograph, was one of the city's premier photographic establishments. Founded in 1872 by James Wallace Black, the studio had earned a reputation for sensitive, dignified memorial and mourning photography. Victorian memorial photographers faced unique technical and emotional challenges. They needed to create images that honored the deceased, comforted the grieving, and met strict social expectations about proper mourning, all while working with the technical limitations of the 1890s photography. The Whitmore Memorial Portrait demonstrates the photographer's skill in multiple ways. First, the composition is carefully balanced. Thomas is positioned slightly off-center, creating visual interest while keeping the focus on him and the doll. The doll is positioned to face the camera directly, making its features clearly visible. This wasn't accidental, but a deliberate choice to showcase the memorial likeness. The lighting is soft and even, achieved through the use of natural light from large studio windows diffused with white fabric. This gentle lighting avoided harsh shadows while providing enough illumination for the relatively slow photographic emulsions of the era, which required several seconds of exposure time. The background and props were meticulously arranged. The black mourning curtains create a somber atmosphere while providing tonal contrast that makes Thomas and the white dressed doll stand out. The small table with Clara's framed photograph creates a visual connection between the living memorial, the doll, and the photographic memorial. The fresh flowers add a subtle touch of life and beauty to an otherwise somber scene. The photographer paid careful attention to Thomas's positioning and expression. The boy sits upright but not stiffly holding the doll with both arms in a protective, embracing posture. His gaze is directed straight at the camera, a direct, unflinching look that conveys both grief and dignity. The technical execution is flawless. The photograph is sharp, properly exposed, and carefully toned. The album and silver print process used by J.W. Black & Company produced rich tonal gradations and fine detail crucial for capturing the delicate features of the memorial doll and the texture of the fabrics. But beyond technical skill, Victorian memorial photographers like those at J.W. Black & Company understood the profound emotional significance of their work. For many families, these photographs were the only tangible way to preserve the memory of their loss. The photographer wasn't just creating an image. They were creating a sacred object that would be treasured for generations. The care taken with the Whitmore family portrait is evident in every detail. This wasn't a rushed commercial transaction, but a thoughtful collaboration between grieving family and skilled craftspeople who understood the weight of their responsibility. The photograph would have been delivered to the Whitmore family several weeks after the sitting, mounted on a thick cabinet card with the studio's name embossed in gold at the bottom. It would have been displayed prominently in their parlor, a public testament to their loss and a private touchstone for their grief. Today, this photograph survives as evidence of Victorian mourning culture, memorial doll practices, and the art of memorial photography, but most importantly, as a document of one family's love and loss, preserved across 125 years. When Dr. Margaret Chun completed the restoration of Thomas Whitmore's memorial portrait in March 2023 and published her findings, the photograph went viral on social media, accumulating millions of views across platforms. But the public reaction revealed something surprising about how we relate to Victorian mourning practices today. Many viewers initially found the photograph disturbing. The idea of creating a doll in a dead child's image, having a surviving sibling pose with it, and preserving that moment photographically seemed makeup to modern sensibilities. Comments ranged from creepy to traumatizing to, "Why would anyone do this to a child?" But as Dr. Chun and other historians provided context about Victorian mourning culture and child mortality, the conversation shifted. People began to see the photograph not as disturbing but as deeply human. A family using the tools and customs of their era to cope with devastating loss. This photograph matters today for several reasons. First, it provides a window into how dramatically our relationship with death has changed. In 1898, death, especially child death, was an unavoidable part of daily life. Most families experienced the loss of at least one child. Mourning was public, formalized, and extensive. Today, death has become medicalized, institutionalized, and largely hidden from view. We have fewer cultural scripts for grief and less experience with loss, especially the loss of children. The Whitmore family's memorial practices, the doll, the formal mourning, the memorial photograph, weren't seen as strange or excessive in their time, but as normal, proper, and necessary expressions of love and grief. Understanding this helps us see that our current discomfort with these practices reveals more about our own culture's relationship with death than about Victorian morbidity. Second, the photograph reminds us of the remarkable progress in child health and survival. Clara Whitmore died of scarlet fever, a disease that is now easily treated with antibiotics. In 1898, it was a death sentence for thousands of children. The memorial doll and photograph are artifacts of an era when parents lived with the constant possibility of losing their children, a fear that, while not eliminated, has been dramatically reduced by modern medicine. Third, the photograph illustrates the universal human need to preserve memory and maintain connection with those we've lost. While we might not create memorial dolls today, we engage in our own memorial practices, social media memorial pages, video tributes, keeping rooms unchanged, wearing memorial jewelry containing ashes. The specific practices change, but the underlying human need remains constant. Fourth, young Thomas Whitmore's experience reminds us that children grieve differently than adults, and that including children in mourning rituals can be both important and healthy. Modern grief counselors actually recommend practices not unlike the memorial photograph, creating opportunities for children to acknowledge loss, express grief, and maintain symbolic connections with deceased siblings. Finally, this photograph has personal significance for the Whitmore family descendants. After Dr. Chun published her findings, she was contacted by Linda Whitmore Harrison, a great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Whitmore. Linda had grown up hearing family stories about Uncle Thomas's sister who died young, but had never seen any photographs or known details of the story. "Seeing this photograph and learning Clara's story has been incredibly moving," Linda said in an interview. For 125 years, this image sat in an archive unidentified and unappreciated. Now, Clara and Thomas's story has been recovered. Their grief has been witnessed. That feels important, like we're honoring their memory the way they deserved all along. The restored photograph has been added to the Library of Congress's permanent collection of significant Victorian memorial photographs. A high-resolution digital copy has been provided to the Whitmore family descendants. Thomas Whitmore, the 8-year-old boy holding his sister's memorial doll in 1898, died in 1962 at age 72. He carried Clara's memory his entire life. Now, through the rediscovery and restoration of this photograph, that memory has been preserved for future generations, ensuring that Clara Whitmore, who died at age 6 in 1898, will not be forgotten. That cute photograph of a boy holding a doll turned out to be something far more profound. A document of love, loss, and the lengths families go to preserve memory. Clara Whitmore lived only 6 years, but through this photograph, through her brother's grief captured in a moment frozen in time, her memory survives 125 years later. Sometimes the most powerful photographs are the ones that reveal their true meaning only when we take the time to really